The crown does not choose the worthy. It chooses whoever is left standing when everyone else has run. Aveline knelt in the mud outside the gates of Sylvain, rain soaking through the cloak that no longer bore her family's crest, and listened to her own name being struck from the royal record. She did not weep. She had promised herself 11 years ago, on the night they sent her away, that she would never give them the satisfaction of her tears again. Behind the gates, torches lit the hall where her younger brother knelt to receive the crown she was born to wear. Cedric's hands trembled as the weight of it settled on his head, not because he wanted it, but because no one had asked him if he could carry it. And somewhere in the dark beyond the city walls, an army that did not yet have a name was already marching toward a kingdom that had just made its gravest mistake. It had thrown away the only daughter strong enough to save it. They named her Aveline because it meant longed for. She would spend the first 19 years of her life trying to understand why a name could lie so completely. She was the firstborn of King Halric and Queen Ismay, heir to the elven throne of Sylvain, by every law written in the kingdom's books. And yet, from the moment she could walk, she understood, in the wordless way children understand the things adults try hardest to hide, that she was not wanted in the way a firstborn should be wanted. Her father did not look at her the way he looked at Cedric, born 3 years after her, golden and easy and unafraid. Halric looked at Cedric the way a man looks at relief. He looked at Aveline the way a man looks at a debt he did not choose to owe. It was never one cruelty. It was 1,000 small ones, each too small to name, each leaving its own hairline fracture. It was her father correcting her posture in front of the court, while Cedric's slouch went unremarked. It was the tutors who were replaced twice for Cedric, and never once for her, because no one believed her education was worth the trouble. It was the way her mother, Queen Ismay, would touch Cedric's hair absently while speaking, and never once touch Aveline's, as though some part of her feared what she might feel if she did. Her swordmaster, an aging elf named Corvain, who had trained 3 generations of Sylvain's nobility, was the closest thing to a kind voice in Aveline's early years, though even his kindness came wrapped in careful distance. He taught her with a rigor he rarely offered other students, pushing her past exhaustion, correcting her stance until her body understood the movements better than her mind did. She once asked him, after a particularly brutal session, why he worked her so much harder than the others. "Because no one else in this palace is preparing you for anything," he said, not unkindly. "If I do not teach you to stand on your own, I fear no one ever will." She did not fully understand, at 11 years old, how prophetic those words would become. She only understood that someone, finally, believed she was worth the effort of building, even if that someone was not her own father. Aveline learned early that the safest place to keep her heart was somewhere no one would think to look for it. She buried her wants so deep that even she sometimes lost them. She told herself she did not care whether her father attended her sword lessons. She told herself she did not care that the kingdom's chroniclers wrote 3 pages on Prince Cedric's birth and 4 lines on hers. She told herself a great many things and believed almost none of them, and kept telling herself anyway, because the alternative was feeling the truth in full, and the truth was unbearable, that she had done nothing wrong, and she was unwanted regardless. What she feared most was not her father's coldness. She had learned to survive that the way one learns to survive a long winter, by enduring, by waiting for a spring that might never come. What she feared was the suspicion, growing quieter and heavier each year, that the coldness was not punishment for something she had done, but a judgment on something she simply was. Not good enough, not soft enough, not easy to love the way Cedric was easy to love. She feared that there was a version of worth she would never reach, no matter how hard she trained, how well she ruled in the small matters they allowed her to touch, how carefully she followed every rule that was supposed to make a princess into a queen. She believed, by the time she was 17, that she was something to be managed rather than someone to be loved, and the cruelest part of that belief was that she had built it herself, brick by brick, out of evidence her own family had handed her freely, year after year, without ever once intending to look back. There was one memory she returned to more than any other, though she never told anyone she kept it. She was 9 years old, and Cedric was 6, and they had hidden together beneath the long council table during a storm, the thunder loud enough to rattle the tall windows of the throne room. Cedric had been frightened, truly frightened, the way only small children are, and Aveline had pulled him against her and told him stories about the stars until the storm passed, simply because no one else had come to find him. It was the first time she understood that being unwanted by some did not mean being unwanted by all. Her brother had fallen asleep against her shoulder that night, and when their mother finally found them at dawn, Ismay's eyes had lingered on Aveline for a long moment, not coldly, but with something unreadable, something almost like fear, as though the sight of her daughter being gentle unsettled her more than any sharpness could have. Aveline never understood that look. She would carry the confusion of it for years, never guessing that it was the first crack in a secret her mother had been guarding since before either child was born. It was around this time, too, that whispers began to follow Aveline through the palace corridors. Not whispers about her failures, which she had grown used to, but stranger ones, murmured by servants who fell silent when she entered a room. Once, she overheard 2 kitchen maids speaking of the star that should never have chosen a firstborn, and when she asked her tutor what they meant, the woman's face went pale, and she changed the subject so quickly that Aveline understood even at 12 years old that she had stumbled into something the adults around her had agreed never to explain. The law that ended Aveline's life in Sylvain was older than her grandmother's grandmother, written into the founding accord in ink that had long since turned the color of dried blood, should the heir to the throne be born under the hollow star. The rare alignment that came once in 100 years, said to mark a soul too powerful, too unpredictable, too dangerous to leave near the seat of power. That heir must be sent from the capital before their 20th name day, lest the kingdom's magic itself grow unstable around them. Aveline had been born under the hollow star. Everyone had always known. It had simply never been spoken aloud, the way a family does not speak aloud of an illness they hope might quietly disappear if no one names it. It did not disappear. 3 weeks before her 20th name day, the royal astronomers confirmed what the court had feared and half hoped for in equal measure, and the accord's old law was read aloud in the throne room for the first time in 4 generations. What the court did not hear, because it was struck from the official reading, buried in a private addendum delivered to the king alone, was the astronomers' second finding, the one that would have changed everything had it been spoken aloud. The hollow star's power, by their own ancient texts, did not manifest as danger in every soul it touched. In most recorded cases across 4 centuries, it manifested as extraordinary clarity, an unusual gift for seeing what others missed, for holding steady where others broke. Only once in the records had it ever truly destabilized a bloodline, and even then, the scholars who studied it admitted they could not say with certainty that the instability had come from the star at all, rather than from the political chaos that followed a contested succession centuries earlier. The danger Sylvain feared was not proven. It was inherited fear, passed down through generations of nobles too frightened to test it, and a king too uncertain of his own crown to be the one who finally did. Halric read that addendum alone, late at night, by a single candle, and told no one, not his wife, not his council, and certainly not his daughter, what it truly said. Her father did not look at her when the scroll was unrolled. That, more than anything else, was the moment Aveline understood. Not when the law was read, but in the half-second of silence before it, when Halrich's eyes found the floor instead of his daughter's face. A man who believed the law was wrong would have looked at her. A man who was relieved did not. "It is not punishment," Queen Yasmai said afterward in the corridor outside Aveline's chambers, her voice low and careful, the voice of someone rehearsing a kindness she did not quite believe herself. "It is protection. For the realm. For you." "Then why?" Aveline asked. "Does it feel like the same thing you have been doing to me since I was born?" Her mother had no answer. Aveline had not expected one. She was given 3 weeks to prepare for a life in exile, in the border settlement of Caldros Hollow, a half-forgotten outpost on the edge of the wild elven territories, where the kingdom sent the things it did not know what else to do with. Disgraced nobles, broken treaties, problems with no clean solution. She was permitted no royal guard, no title beyond her name, no promise of return. Cedric, 16 and pale with a grief he did not yet have the vocabulary for, found her the night before she left, sitting alone in the stables because she could not stand to be inside the palace walls a moment longer. "This isn't right," he said. "I'll tell them I don't want it. The throne, any of it. I'll tell them." "You'll tell them nothing," Aveline said. And for the first time in years, her voice cracked just slightly, just enough for her brother to hear it. "You didn't do this, Cedric. Don't you dare carry it like you did." He was the only person in that palace who had ever looked at her like she was someone worth keeping. And in the morning, she would leave him behind to wear a crown neither of them had ever wanted him to wear alone. As her horse crossed the eastern bridge out of Sylvain, Aveline did not look back at the tower she had grown up in. She looked forward, toward a horizon she did not recognize, and asked herself the only question that mattered now. If no one in that palace had ever truly wanted her, then who, if anyone, ever would? Caldros Hollow was not the wilderness Aveline had imagined in her worst nights at the palace. It was worse, in its own quiet way, and better, in a way she had not expected at all, because no one here knew her as the daughter who had disappointed her father. No one here knew her at all. She arrived with nothing but a single trunk and a letter of introduction that the settlement's garrison commander did not bother to read in full before setting it on his desk and looking at her properly for the first time. His name was Soren, a half-elf with quiet eyes and a guarded posture, the kind of man who had clearly learned, the same way Aveline had, that trust was something earned in small increments rather than given freely. "You are the princess," he said. It was not a question. "I was," Aveline said. "I'm not certain what I am now." Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, which she would have hated, but a kind of recognition, as though he understood exactly what it meant to be sent somewhere and told to make peace with it. "Caldros doesn't care what you were," he said. "Out here, you're only useful for what you can do." It should have stung. Instead, it was the first honest thing anyone in a position of authority had said to her in years, and Aveline found, to her own surprise, that she preferred it to every gentle lie the palace had ever offered her. The first months were brutal in ways the palace had never prepared her for. Not the physical labor which she could endure, but the loneliness of being entirely unknown. She trained with the garrison because Soren, without ever quite asking permission, simply began including her in the drills, as though her presence there were no more remarkable than anyone else's. She mended fences. She learned which families in the settlement went hungry in the lean months, and began, quietly, redirecting what little she had toward them, not because anyone asked her to, but because for the first time in her life, no one was watching to judge whether she did it correctly. Soren noticed before she did. He noticed the way she flinched, faintly, whenever someone raised a hand too quickly near her, an old reflex from a childhood of careful self-protection. He noticed that she never spoke of her family unless asked, and even then, only in the fewest words she could manage. He noticed, most of all, that she worked like someone trying to prove something to a version of herself that no longer lived in that palace. And he never once told her to stop, only made certain in small and unspoken ways that she was not doing it entirely alone. It was not a sudden thing between them. It was not the kind of love the old ballads sang of, struck like lightning across a crowded hall. It built the way trust builds, in the silence after a long day's work, when he handed her water before she asked for it, in the way he positioned himself, without comment, between her and any stranger who looked at her too long, not because she needed protecting, but because he had decided somewhere along the way that he wanted to be the kind of man who did it anyway. In the night, she finally told him, in pieces, about the hollow star and the law and her father's eyes finding the floor. And he listened without once trying to fix it, only said, "That was never about you. That was about what they were too afraid to carry." No one had ever said that to her before. It was months before she learned that Soren carried his own version of her wound. Though he wore it differently, he never spoke of his life before Caldros unless pressed, and even then only in fragments. A mother who was elven nobility and a father who was not. A childhood spent in a border province where he belonged fully to neither world, too common for the elven courts, and too elven for the human settlements that bordered them. He had been given command of Caldros's garrison not as an honor she came to understand, but as its own quiet exile, a posting handed to a man whose blood made certain commanders uneasy, however capable he proved himself to be. He never said it bitterly. He said it the way one states a fact about weather, something simply to be endured rather than fought. But Aveline recognized the particular ache beneath that flatness, because she had spent years perfecting the very same tone herself. "We're not so different," she told him once, on a night when the settlement was quiet and the stars over Caldros seemed closer than they ever had above Sylvain's towers. "Both of us spent somewhere because we made someone uncomfortable simply by existing. Maybe," Soren said, "or maybe we were both sent somewhere we were finally allowed to become ourselves. I've stopped being certain which story is true." She thought about that more than she let on, but even as something steadied in her, something that had been unmoored since childhood, new fractures were already forming elsewhere. Word came rarely from Sylvain, and what little came was troubling. The harvest taxes, raised twice in 1 year. Reports of unrest in the outer provinces. A young king who signed decrees he did not fully understand, because the men around him assured him it was simply how things were done. Aveline told herself it was no longer her concern. She told herself this more than once, the way she had once told herself she did not care about her father's silence, and believed it just as little. And if you're still here with me, subscribe to Elf Stories. There are many more unforgettable tales waiting to be told. 3 years passed in Caldros Hollow, and in that time, Aveline became someone her father would not have recognized, not because she had changed who she was, but because she had finally been allowed to become it without interference. She and Soren never spoke openly of what was growing between them. There was an unspoken agreement, never discussed but deeply understood, that naming it too soon might shatter something neither of them was ready to risk. Instead, it lived in the spaces between words, in the way he began, without ever announcing it, to walk the eastern patrol route a few minutes later than necessary, so their paths might cross at the well where she drew water each evening. In the way she started leaving an extra portion at his door on the nights the garrison ran short, never speaking of it, never expecting thanks. In the careful, deliberate distance they kept in front of others, and the way that distance dissolved completely the moment they were alone. There was a week, that same autumn, when Soren pulled back without explanation, found reasons to walk the western route instead of the eastern one, found reasons to be occupied when she lingered near the well. Aveline told herself she imagined it. The same old reflex of assuming any withdrawal of warmth was a verdict on her worth. But when she finally asked him plainly, he did not deny it. "I've watched men in this garrison get attached to things," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Land, people. And then watched the crown decide those things belong somewhere else after all. I don't know how to want something I might not be allowed to keep." "I'm not a posting, Soren," she said quietly. "No one can reassign me away from you." "Sylvain sent you away once already," he said. "Forgive me for not trusting that the world only does that sort of thing one time." She had no answer for that. Not then. It was the first real silence between them, and it lasted 4 days, until the night the raiders came and answered the question neither of them had been brave enough to finish. There was one evening, early autumn, the air sharp with the first cold of the season, when a raid struck the settlement's northern edge. Elven raiders from beyond the border, testing Kaldros's defenses the way they tested every outpost too small to properly defend itself. Aveline fought beside the garrison without hesitation, years of training in the palace finally finding their true purpose. And in the chaos of it, she watched Soren take a blade meant for a settlement boy no older than 12, the wound opening deep across his shoulder before he even registered the pain. She did not remember deciding to run to him. She only remembered kneeling in the dirt afterward, her hands pressed hard against the wound, her voice cracking as she told him to stay awake, stay with her, and the strange, terrified clarity of realizing in that moment exactly how much she had let herself need him. "You're shaking," he said afterward, once the wound was bound and the worst of the danger had passed, his voice rough with exhaustion but steady. "I didn't know you could shake." "I didn't either," Aveline admitted, and for the first time and longer than she could remember, she let someone see her fear plainly, without armor over it. He reached for her hand, slowly giving her every chance to pull away. She did not, but that night carried its own warning beneath the tenderness. The raiders who struck Kaldros had not come for plunder. They had come asking in the brief and brutal interrogation before they were driven off whether the rumors were true, whether the exiled princess of Sylvain was truly hiding in this forgotten outpost, and whether a reward still stood for whoever delivered her, alive, to whoever was offering it. Aveline did not sleep that night. Someone in Sylvain, someone close enough to the throne to know where she had been sent, and care enough to put a price on finding her, wanted her found. The question that kept her staring at the ceiling long after Soren's breathing had finally evened into sleep beside her was not whether the danger was real. It was who wanted her back badly enough to pay for it, and whether they wanted her returned alive or wanted her gone for good, in a way that would finally settle the matter for good. The messenger arrived 11 days later, road-worn and barely able to stand, bearing a royal seal that had not been sent to Kaldros Hollow in 3 years. Aveline broke it with hands that did not shake, not this time, and read the words twice before she allowed herself to believe them. Sylvain was failing, not to invasion, not to war, but to something slower and crueler, a kingdom collapsing under the weight of a king too young, too unprepared, and too proud to admit either. Cedric had inherited the crown at 16, with no proper regency, no one willing to truly guide him, only courtiers eager to whisper in his ear for their own advantage. He had spent 3 years making the desperate decisions of a boy trying to prove he belonged somewhere he had never asked to be placed, raising taxes to fund a border garrison he did not understand, signing trade agreements written by men who did not have Sylvain's interests at heart, exiling advisors who told him the truth in favor of those who told him what he wanted to hear. The granaries were emptying. 2 provinces had stopped paying tribute entirely, citing a king they no longer trusted to rule them. And worst of all, the letter said, in handwriting Aveline recognized instantly as her brother's own, shaking with an honesty he had never been permitted to show their father. "I do not know how to do this. I never wanted it. I only know that if no one comes, there will be nothing left to inherit at all." It was not a summons. It was a confession. and beneath it, unspoken but unmistakable, a plea. Aveline sat with the letter long after the messenger had been given food and rest, and it was there, alone, that the second truth arrived, not from the page, but from her own memory, finally assembling itself into a shape she had refused to see clearly for 3 long years. She remembered her mother's face the day the law was read, not relief, as she had once believed, grief, carefully hidden, the particular grief of someone forced to choose between 2 children and required to act as though the choice cost her nothing. She remembered, too, a fragment of conversation overheard outside her father's council chamber months before her exile. Voices arguing, one insisting the hollow star prophecy could be quietly suppressed, kept from the court entirely, and her father's voice, low and final, saying that the realm's nobles already suspected, and a king who tried to hide the truth would lose far more than a daughter. He had not sent her away because he believed the prophecy. He had sent her away because he was afraid of what the court would do to his entire reign if he did not. It had never been about whether Aveline was dangerous. It had been about whether her father was strong enough to survive the accusation that he harbored something dangerous beneath his roof. The realization did not soften the wound. If anything, it deepened it in a new direction, because a father who exiled his daughter out of genuine belief was, in some terrible way, easier to forgive than a father who had done it knowing it was likely unnecessary, simply because it was safer for his crown. And there was a third truth, the cruelest of the 3, waiting beneath the first 2. Cedric had not been groomed for the throne because anyone believed he was ready. He had been handed it because Aveline was gone, and a kingdom cannot function without an heir standing visibly in line. And a frightened 16-year-old boy was the only piece left on the board. He had not stolen anything from her. He had been thrown into a fire neither of them had chosen, and he had been drowning in it alone for 3 years, while she had been 3 days' ride away, learning to mend fences and fall in love, telling herself it was no longer her concern. There was one final piece, smaller than the others, but somehow the one that struck deepest, tucked into the letter's final lines almost as an afterthought. Cedric had written that their mother, in the 2 years since Aveline's exile, had grown ill in a way the healers could not fully name. A slow fading that had begun, he noted, almost exactly when the law was read, as though something in Ismay had simply stopped fighting once her daughter was gone. He wrote it without accusation, only confusion, not understanding what Aveline understood instantly. Her mother's silence in that corridor so many years ago had never been indifference. It had been a woman watching her own husband choose his crown over his daughter, and finding she did not have the courage to choose differently in front of him. And the cost of that unspoken cowardice had been quietly killing her ever since. The look Ismay had given her that morning beneath the council table all those years ago suddenly made sense. It had not been fear of Aveline. It had been grief for a daughter she already suspected she would one day be too afraid to protect. Soren found her still sitting with the letter long after dark. He did not ask what it said. He only watched her face, and after a long moment, he said the thing she had not yet allowed herself to say aloud. "You're going back. I don't know what I'm going back to," Aveline said. "A kingdom that threw me away. A brother drowning in a crown that was never his to carry alone. A father who—" Her voice caught, and she let it, because there was no longer anyone left to perform composure for. "A father who didn't even believe I was dangerous. He just didn't want to find out what it would cost him to keep me. Does that change whether you go?" She looked up at him, and in his eyes she saw the same fear she felt rising in her own chest. Not fear of Sylvain, but fear of what returning might cost the fragile, hard-won life they had built here, the one place in the world that had never once asked her to be anything other than herself. "No," she said quietly. "It doesn't change anything at all." She returned to Sylvain on a gray morning, 3 years and 1 season after she had left it, and the city she rode into was barely the one she remembered. The market squares stood half empty. The royal banners hung faded and unmended from towers that had once gleamed, and in the throne room, when she finally stood before it again, she found not the imposing seat of her childhood memory, but a chair that seemed to have grown too large for the young king sitting in it. Cedric was 19 now, and he looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the shore, not with shame at needing rescue, but with a desperate, naked relief that broke something open in Aveline's chest. Before either of them spoke a single word, he rose from the throne so quickly it nearly toppled and crossed the hall, and for a moment, the king of Sylvain was simply a boy again, holding on to his sister as though letting go might mean losing her a second time. "I'm sorry," he said into her shoulder again and again, the words tumbling out faster than he could organize them. "I'm sorry. I should have refused it. I should have fought for you. I should have—" "You were 16, Aveline said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it without a trace of bitterness. "You didn't do this to me, Cedric. I told you that the night before I left, and I'm telling you again now. You carried something you never should have had to carry alone. That isn't a sin. That's just what happens to children left holding what adults were too afraid to hold themselves." She found her mother 2 days later, in a chamber that smelled faintly of healing herbs and dust, Ismay propped against pillows that seemed to swallow her thinner frame. The queen's eyes opened slowly when Aveline entered, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You came," Ismay finally said, her voice frail but clear. "I should have been told," Aveline said, and found that the anger she expected to feel had already burned down to something quieter, sadder, about all of it. "The astronomer's true report. What you and father actually argued about before I was sent away." Ismay's eyes filled, and for once she did not try to hide it. "I told myself silence was protecting you. It was only ever protecting myself. From having to admit I let your father choose his crown over his daughter, and I was too afraid to stand against him." Her hand, thin and trembling, reached for Aveline's. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am only asking you to know that I have never once, in 11 years, stopped being your mother in every way except the ways that mattered." Aveline did not answer with words. She only took her mother's hand and held it, the way she once held her brother beneath a council table during a storm, offering the comfort that had never once been offered to her. Not because the wound was healed, but because she had finally learned in Caldros Hollow that love could be given honestly even to those who had not yet earned it back. It was in the days that followed, as Aveline walked the granaries with him, reviewed the broken trade agreements, sat beside him in council sessions where she watched, with growing alarm, how thoroughly the courtiers had learned to manipulate a king desperate for approval, that the truth of the kingdom's collapse became fully clear. Sylvain was not dying from any curse, any enemy, any prophecy. It was dying because it had exiled the one heir prepared to rule it, and crowned, in her place, a boy it had never bothered to prepare at all. And it was in those same days that the impossible choice finally arrived, delivered not by a villain, not by a single cruel voice, but by the quiet, mounting consensus of an entire, desperate court. The law of the Hollow Star could be set aside. The accord allowed for it. In dire circumstance, with the agreement of the High Council, Aveline could be restored. She could take the crown that had always, by blood and law, belonged to her first. All she had to do was let her brother step down. The council made the case to her plainly, almost gently, as though they were offering her a gift rather than a blade. Cedric was failing through no true fault of his own, but failing all the same, and the kingdom did not have years to wait for him to grow into a strength he might never find. Aveline had spent 3 years learning to govern in miniature, to lead, to earn trust the hard way, in a settlement that had taught her more about ruling than the palace ever had. She was, by every practical measure, exactly what Sylvain needed. She found Cedric alone on the eastern balcony that night, the same balcony where, as children, they had once hidden from their father's counsels to count stars neither of them could name. He did not turn when she approached. He had clearly already heard. "They want you to take it," he said, "and they're right to want it. I know I am not what this kingdom needs. I've known it since the day they put the crown on my head, and I felt how much heavier it was than I expected." "Cedric, I'm not angry," he said, and turned to face her, and there were tears in his eyes that he did not bother hiding. The same honesty he had shown in his letter. "I have spent 3 years drowning Aveline. If you take it from me, I think it might be the first time in years I'm finally able to breathe. It would have been so simple to take what was offered. The law allowed it. The council wanted it. Her brother, in his exhaustion, was nearly begging for it. Every ambition she had buried as a girl, every year of feeling unwanted and unworthy, could be answered in a single word of acceptance. Proof, finally undeniable proof, that she had always been the one who deserved it. But she thought of Caldros Hollow. She thought of Soren's hand finding hers without demanding anything in return. She thought of 3 years spent learning that worth was not something proven to other people, but something built quietly, in rooms no one was watching. And she thought of her brother's face on that very balcony when they were children, looking at her not as a rival, not as competition for a crown, but as the only person in that entire palace who had ever simply wanted her to stay. "No," she said. Cedric blinked. "No, I won't take it from you," Aveline said, her voice steady even as something in her chest ached with the cost of the choice. "Not because you don't need help, Cedric. You do, and I'm not leaving again, I promise you that. But you are not your fear of failing. You're the boy who tried to refuse the throne the night before I left because he thought it belonged to me. That boy is still in there. He just needs someone to stand beside him instead of standing over him." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'll stay," she said. "Not as your replacement, as your regent, your shield, your sister, for as long as it takes you to find the king you're capable of becoming. The crown stays on your head, but you will never again carry it alone." It was not the triumphant reclaiming the court had expected. It was something quieter, and in its quiet, something far harder. Aveline choosing, with eyes fully open, to give up the one thing that might have finally proven her worth beyond all doubt, in favor of the brother who had never once made her feel unworthy to begin with. Some of the council never understood her choice. They called it waste, called it sentiment where strategy was needed, and for a long while, Aveline let them believe whatever explanation comforted them most. She did not owe the court the truth of it, that she had spent her whole life believing worth was something proven once, decisively, to silence every doubter forever, and that Caldros Hollow had finally taught her otherwise. Worth was not a crown placed once upon a head. It was chosen again, quietly, every single day after. She did not need Sylvain's throne to know what she had become. She had already become it, in a forgotten border settlement, long before anyone in this palace thought to look for her there. The kingdom steadied slowly, the way wounds do when they are finally tended rather than ignored. Within a year, the granaries filled again. Within 2, the outer provinces returned their tribute, not out of fear, but because word had spread of a regent who listened before she ruled. Cedric grew into the crown at last, not because it had grown lighter, but because he was no longer the only one carrying it. Ismay's health returned slowly, in step with her daughter's presence, as though some part of her had simply been waiting for permission to heal. Halric never found the words to apologize fully. Some fathers never do. But Aveline noticed in small, unspoken ways that he began attending her council sessions, began asking her counsel on matters he once would never have trusted to her judgment. It was not the love she had spent a childhood longing for, but it was, finally, a kind of respect, offered too late to undo the years it had cost her, and accepted anyway, because Aveline had learned in Caldross Hollow that healing rarely arrives as the apology you once needed, only as whatever honesty finally becomes available. Aveline never returned to Caldross Hollow to stay, but Soren came to Sylvain instead, and what grew between them in the quiet hours away from the council halls remained, just as it always had, unhurried and entirely their own. The court came to call her many things in the years that followed: the regent of Sylvain, the princess of the Hollow Star, the woman who could have taken a crown and chose a brother instead. But Aveline remembered best the version of herself that had once knelt in the rain outside a gate that no longer wanted her, certain that her story had already ended. It had not ended. It had only been waiting for her to write the rest of it herself.